and journalism at University of Vermont and elsewhere. I have run a newspaper currently called Vermont Independent, online at vermontindependent.net. Gosh, for almost 15 years now. We're a small, independent, decentralist operation. I am an avid news consumer, a bit of a news hound, and I do a lot of writing for various news publications as well. So I'm certainly not an expert on news, but I think a lot about news and information, and I talk with a lot of people about news and information. So I'm going to wear multiple hats, as all good Vermonters do tonight, wear my multiple news hats. So a couple of caveats. P.T. Barnum once said, I just ran across this observation, P.T. Barnum, the great showman, right, once said, "He who is without a newspaper is cut off from his species." I'd never heard that line before. He who is without a newspaper is cut off from his species. And it got me thinking about why we all consume news. So any thoughts about that? Why do you consume news? Karen, why do you consume news? I'm going to put you on the spot.
To be informed, to try to make the right decisions, and stay educated.
Nice. Lauren, Glenn, how about you?
I think the same reason as Karen. I, for one time, didn't pay any attention to the news for about 20 years. And because it was such a bummer. And then when it got really bad, I started to pay attention to it.
So it had to get really bad.
I felt I had a responsibility to know what was happening.
Barry, what about you?
Yeah, that resonates. That last piece really resonates with me. And I think the first piece about connection to others, other things that are happening around the world, not just in my local community, but in this global community. And I think that's also something that's evolved as the world has both, in a lot of ways, gotten both bigger and smaller. I feel like I have a responsibility to know what's going on. Then I don't exactly know what to do with it, and I feel guilty, but that's a whole other story.
Maybe we'll get there. Yeah. Melody, anything to add?
Fairly similar. I think the aspect of connection, feeling connected, feeling like I know what's happening in the world around me, at least somewhat factually in a fantasy, if I don't always know what to do with the information.
Nice. Yeah.
Kind of puts my own life in perspective.
Ooh, how so?
I might have had a really rough morning with my small children, and then I get in the car and hear about how Syrians are starving and living in their homes.
Right.
Puts things back in perspective about how
Wow.
good I have it.
Context and perspective, yeah. Yeah. Does anybody feel cut off from your species if you're not connecting to news? Back to P.T. Barnum.
Well, I feel like I'm cut off from half the species.
I'm a different species.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I mean. I think that because what I read is very tailored to what I believe. Like I'm not omnivorous, really.
Yeah.
I read the Times and the Post and the Guardian.
Ooh. Yeah.
So I'm not omnivorous because I'm interested in what they have to say and I have that much time.
I just recently, with everything that was going on with the Kavanaugh hearings, I found myself kind of reading, like NPR is probably my primary source of news. But I was getting into a lot of heated debates and arguments with people, and I was trying to sort of...
I think you were the only one.
In order really to try to understand their perspective, I went onto Fox News, and it was painful for me. But I found it interesting that it's like, where are the facts? Because you have an event or something that's going on in the world, and then you have one take on it from one side and another take on it. So where is the middle, or where it's like having two sides to every story, but how do you know who's embellishing facts to fit their beliefs and who's really just reporting facts?
Yeah, or multiple sides, I like to say.
Yes.
To every story, yeah. Nice.
To the question of feeling cut off, I think I do feel somewhat cut off from my species if I'm not listening to the news. Like my car radio hasn't been working very well lately. It's cutting in and out. And I usually listen to NPR on the way to and from work. And even if I don't know what major events have happened and people are talking about it, I'm like, oh, what did I miss? I don't know the events that everybody's talking about. So you can't engage with people around those things if you don't know what they are. So.
Yeah. Yeah, news brings with it, I think, a certain amount of social capital, right? A certain amount of what are we going to talk about at the water cooler today, kind of a phenomenon. And I think, I talk to a lot of people about news, and I think a lot of us consume news out of habit. I think our news consumption rituals are very habitual. And so it's encouraging to hear that some of you are like trying to push beyond your zone of comfort, shall we say. So, well, let me, in the interest of being a little provocative, let me throw out a couple of introductory starting points. And then I want to hear from you, like what your kind of news sources are. We've already had a few mentioned, but so here's a few starting points. So I had 5, and then I thought of another one that I think should come first, so I'm calling it point number 0. So bear with me. Point number 0, it's not the Russians' fault. Whatever news culture we have to work with, it's not Vladimir Putin's fault. It's number 1. We can come back to that. Sorry, number 0. Point number 1. So this term fake news, tonight's talk and conversation is called The Real Deal About Fake News. And the term fake news, I think, is a kind of a newly weaponized term for an older phenomenon, which we could call misinformation, which is kind of a one-off, when mistakes are made about the accuracy of news. Or number 2, maybe fake news is about disinformation, which is a more strategic attempt to misinform over time, if you will. Usually there's like it's a kind of a strategic campaign to disinform rather than a one-off to misinform. Or fake news, I think, is propaganda. It's the strategic creation and deployment of one-sided information with intent to persuade, right? Propaganda. So, and I would suggest that a lot of the news that we deem news is actually more kind of propagandistic than we might want to admit. We can come back around to that. The term fake news, by the way, was not coined by Mr. Trump. It was actually coined by Ms. Clinton. And then Mr. Trump tweeted the term so much that we think that he invented the term fake news. But I think it was first used by Hillary Clinton. Point number 2, 0, it's not the Russians' fault. Number 1, fake news. Point number 1 is an old phenomenon, but a new term, new weaponized term for that. Point number 2, I just mentioned, I think that a lot of what we consider kind of legitimate U.S. news is in fact maybe something else. So maybe we can talk more about that. Rather than thinking in terms of like liberal news channels and conservative news channels, I tend to think in terms of like what I call the C trend in news, corporate, commercial, centralized news outlets, many of which have been mentioned. So there's the C trend, and then there's the D trend, which is, we're in the flagship of the D trend here at CCTV, which is news that is decentralized, diverse in terms of multiple voices, and small d democratic, kind of produced from the ground up, if you will. I mean, we've got an amazing crew running the show here, and they're about to disappear for dinner. Fantastic. So the C trend versus the D trend rather than the red versus the blue. That makes sense. Point number 3. So here are 5 ways not to consume news. Number 1, I think watching news is bad. I think reading is better, right? Because when you read news, you get a lot more sort of depth and detail and nuance, and you control the speed with which you ingest information, which I think is hugely important. Number 2, the second way not to consume news, a single source or a single show or a single celebrity newscaster is probably not a good way to consume news. I'm sitting in the Rachel Maddow chair, the stool I recognize, but having a single source of go-to for news is probably not all that healthy.
Can we ask questions?
Of course.
Wait?
Yeah, let me finish my list here, and then we'll come back around. Third way not to watch news, a single channel, I think, is not a good idea. So if you're a Fox News consumer, you know, play to another source that is maybe a little less foxy. And if you're a Democracy Now! News consumer, play to another source that's a little less Goodman-y, if you will. Fourth way not to consume news, a single app is bad. It's amazing to me how many people sort of take in news through like an app on their mobile phone, and I think you're just giving over your news stream to the most powerful media corporation in the world. Why would you do that, right? Google, for example, right? So, not that you shouldn't look at the news apps, but don't have them be your only kind of go-to source. And then finally, the fifth way not to consume news, social media platforms can be trouble, right? Our trusted friends are more and more turning out to be like bots or sock puppets or, you know, algorithmically driven creatures from another universe. Maybe Moscow, but probably not. So, so the fourth point, I wanted to define real news. We're talking about the real deal about fake news. So I define real news with kind of 6 simple elements. First of all, real news is storied information. Like, we forget about the power of stories when we think about news sometimes, but news really is kind of stories that are created to sort of pass on information. So real news is storied information that has 6 criteria. Number 1, real news is recent. Number 2, it's relevant. Number 3, it's reliable, which is to say you can tell where the information is being sourced from. That's what I mean by reliable. Number 4, real news is historically grounded. So if you're doing a story about Syria, you know, Syria came up before, there's some kind of like historical context to that story. It's not like, here's what happened in Syria in the past 5 minutes, right? But there's some context there. Number 5, real news is, I'm going to be really kind of graduate school for a minute, hegemonically hip. Hegemony has to do with sort of the nature of power and power relations, who has it, who doesn't. So hegemonically hip is a news story that grounds, kind of foregrounds power relations. Not like a he said, she said, blue versus red, but more kind of multiple points of view and multiple power points within the news story. And then finally, real news is, as my Chinese friends like to say, harmonious, which is to say it has multiple points of view. It's not a single point of view. So recent, relevant, reliable, historically grounded, hegemonically hip, and harmonious. That to me is like the essence of a really good real news story.
Is that an acronym?
No, but it should be. It should be. And last point, and then we'll jump into the filters, but first we'll talk about news sources. So people always ask me about solutions, like what do we do? And I hate waiting on solutions to the end. So I'm just gonna lay out some solutions here and then we can talk more about them. It seems like let's get to the good stuff. So the first solution I think is to really practice cradle to grave critical media literacy education. Like, I think we need to start teaching ourselves when we're really young to really sort of step back and be skeptical of all news sources, because all news sources have biases and that's okay, but to recognize that that's just sort of the reality of being a human being and living in the world, right? Bringing a critical approach to bear is really important. Again, reading is better than watching. I think in analog, print forms of news are better than digital forms for lots of different reasons. And I realize we're moving pell-mell into the digital world. But second solution is to embrace multiple news sources, like cast a wide net. Third solution is to really support channels and organizations like CCTV, news that you can use, news that is local, it's independent, it has access, it brings in a lot of different voices from the community to the conversation. And fourth, I think the answer to hate speech or censorship is more speech, right? Dialogue is really important, and creating news that allows for people to listen to one another and engage in sort of multi-way conversations is really important. Never before than now, perhaps. So, some solutions to think about. So let's pause there for a minute. So questions, and then we'll go around and share our news sources, and then we'll jump into the filters. Megan. Hello.
Can you talk more about the answer to hate speech is more speech in light of like Twitter?
Yeah.
Certain accounts, and
yeah,
terms of service.
Absolutely. The EULAs, the end user license agreements, all. Yeah, we're going to get to that.
Oh, okay.
No, but I'm glad you asked it, because and in terms of Twitter, I think we all have to kind of make our peace with the onslaught of information that we're faced with every day. There was a time when I was actively involved in Twitter. I'm just speaking personally now. I'm off Twitter right now. To me, it's just become kind of too toxic, frankly, of an environment. And I just don't want to play and work in that space right now. So I'm taking a break from, I'm on a Twitter fast. I've said no to the tweeple, to the twibe. For now. You know, occasionally I kind of, you know, maybe kind of tune in, but but the larger question you ask, I think, is important. So if you believe, as I think many of us do, that dialogue, literally the process of sort of learning to understand each other better through the word, like through the spoken word and through the written word, but I think particularly through the spoken word, then more dialogue and more speech, I think, is better than less. I'll give you an example. Alex Jones, who was just thrown off of pretty much every social media platform in existence, right, whenever that was, 6 weeks ago, is an interesting case because Alex Jones is a very popular, still a very popular independent news voice. Many people think he's somewhat conspiratorial and would engage in hate speech and what have you. But I'd much rather know what Alex Jones is saying, publicly, and sort of be able to kind of keep an eye on Alex Jones rather than driving Alex Jones underground by throwing him off of a few social media platforms. But he's not going to go away. But where did he go? I don't know. I don't know what he's up to now. So that's my own sort of feeling about that. And that's not an endorsement of Alex Jones. It's simply to say that, kind of, maybe it's sort of Sun Tzu's Art of War, like keep your friends close and your enemies closer a little bit. You kind of want to keep an eye on and let the conversations happen rather than try and sort of police and censor them. But that'd be something interesting to talk about, because I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying that's kind of my own take. Barry, do you want to jump in?
I did. So I had a couple of questions, and it's amazing I remembered them. The first one was just in response, or a question, a curiosity about whether this real news versus fake news is something that is unique to the United States. Our history of freedom of speech and expression, has that created an opportunity for it? I don't know. And then my second question was, when you talked about some of the things that we could do or should do, and one was read the news. Does it matter whether you read it online or if you actually pick up a newspaper, what have you, magazine, and read it? So those were my two thoughts.
Those are great questions. So let's take the first one first. So the U.S. news culture versus other countries. Right. So anybody have any thoughts about that? Is the U.S. news culture kind of unique with our commitment to the First Amendment, for example, at least on paper?
Or maybe it's corporate sponsorship. It's certainly the pendulum has probably swung that way.
Yeah.
Well, European newspapers have never been, they've always been unapologetically partisan.
Yes. And there was a time in the U.S. when that was the case.
Exactly. But we sort of operate under this illusion that we don't, we still do operate that way, but we kind of pretend that we don't.
Yeah. When newsrooms were professionalized after the Civil War, 1870s, 1880s, we kind of bowed down now to the cult of objectivity with a capital O, like just the facts, ma'am, kind of an approach. But I think Lauren Glenn just said it. It's never really been that way. Mm-hmm. I'm actually, as someone who runs a newspaper with a political point of view, Vermont Independent, we're a decentralist publication. I would much prefer to have multiple voices in the community that reflect different political perspectives rather than a single voice pretending to be objective, which was the way it was in the United States before the Civil War. You could walk into any big city like Chicago or Boston, New York, and you could go to a news rack and pick up literally 8 daily papers, each with a different political point of view. And I like that option better. It's a little more work to try to figure out what's going on from different perspectives, but I'd much prefer that to a single monolithic voice pretending to be objective when it's not. And to sort of go global for a minute, so I've done a lot of work and traveled quite a bit in China and talked to a lot of Chinese friends and colleagues about news over there. And the official kind of Chinese news as it's served up to 1.5 billion Chinese is, you know, it's the party line, right? It's the Communist Party kind of blessing and sanctifying everything before it goes out with an army of, you know, fact checkers and censors if, you know, stuff creeps through the gate. And it's why the Chinese are, like, more than any other group of people on the planet, they are gaga about social media because they feel like they can actually reach out to friends and neighbors in other towns and other cities in China and get kind of a little bit more of a authentic, if you will, perspective on, like, what's going on. And even there, it's complicated because, of course, the Chinese government has built a national, you know, internet backbone that is capable of kind of watching everybody as they consume those news. And now they're tying it to the Sesame credit system of social validation, and it's pretty wild. And most importantly, most Chinese, when polled, seem to support all of that in the name of kind of Confucian ideals and kind of virtue as a, you know, harmony, you know, kind of some very Confucian concepts. Yeah.
So is there a similar fake news, you know, the infiltration of social media in China that is? Oh,
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, so the Chinese government, yeah. So if there's a controversial story that kind of breaks in the world of Chinese social media, the government will deploy two responses. One is to try and stamp it out via censors and thought police and, you know, setting up internet gates. But the other thing they'll do is they'll deploy a whole mass of distracting information through the social media channels to kind of divert Chinese people's attention away from whatever controversy is brewing, right? And more governments are figuring out, including, I'm afraid, our own here in the United States, are figuring out how to use kind of social media as distraction to kind of divide.
What is authentic on social media?
What's that?
What is authentic?
Well, so that's, I mean, it's really kind of a case by case.
But, I mean, what do you think is authentic
on
social media?
You mean in terms of a platform or in terms of a story?
The story, like the interaction when you say.
Oh, well, that's a good question. So if I'm so let's say I'm talking with a trusted friend, right? Somebody who I know is kind of thoughtful and kind of well researched and isn't going to serve it up to me with any kind of BS attached, right? All I can do is trust that I'm getting information, newsworthy information from that source. But it's complicated, right? Yeah, it's complicated. Barry, I'm trying to, your second question, so
My second question was about reading.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
news.
So how many of you, I love this question. So how many of you have read the same news article in print and on a screen and kind of thought about the experience of that? Because I would argue that, anybody done that? Because I would argue, you know, it's the same news story, but it's a very different experience.
Although, often the headlines are changed.
Oh yeah, well there's that. Yeah, there's the way it's presented on a screen versus in print. But even just the process of sort of the way we ingest information. Nicholas Carr, who wrote a wonderful book you should all read called The Shallows, maybe some of you read it, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. But he has this amazing metaphor. I think I shared this in St. Albans, actually. He talks about books and the printed word as like an attention focusing medium, and the internet and digital news as an attention scattering medium. Just because, you know, we're hyperlinked to death online, and it's so hard to focus because there's bells and whistles and links, and so take the same news article. It's like, oh, I can kind of dive down, as he likes to say, as a scuba diver into the sea of words, and really kind of sort of hover there and think about it. But over here, I'm like a jet skier, like scooting atop the surface of this internet story, because I'm like, oh, take that hyperlink over there, and let's see this chart, and so.
Well, I also think even if you do deep reading online on your phone, like you read an article that's a long article, you know, like the article about Trump's his family's, the basement of records they found about his father's tax returns, right? That story went on. It took an hour to read.
Yeah, it was a long story.
But the difference is that I had this serotonin uptake, like while I'm reading it, because I'm going, and when I'm reading it in paper, I'm not having that. Like I'm not getting, the bells aren't getting rung in the same way.
And how is it that the screen produces serotonin for you, Lauren Glenn, but the paper doesn't? Like, did you think about, like, what's the answer to that?
I think it's the nature of the electronic device and what you've come to expect in your relationship with it. I mean, I think it's why people don't walk around with packs of cigarettes as much as they used to, because the phone is the same size and they have the same relationship, addictive brain relationship. And I think that affects how you perceive the information you're taking in.
Yeah, we are. You know, Elon Musk likes to say we're cyborgs, right? Our machines are such intimate extensions of who we are, and I think that's a really wild example of that.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to comment on that? Look, there's a mobile phone now with a news story on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other thoughts about that? We can come back around.
Well, and I would just say one other thing, which is now in the times when they have that virtual, like you can move your phone and see a 3D version of that thing.
Yeah.
So they're creating these immersive experiences that also ring the bells in your brain.
Yeah.
I find I have kind of the opposite experience in that if I'm scrolling through news, I tend to digitally, here's a headline, here's a headline, here's a headline, do I want to read more? Where I feel like if I'm reading something that's in a magazine or a newspaper, I have to be able to dedicate the time and know as I'm reading it, like, okay, if I'm going to start reading this, I need to have, 5 minutes that I want to sit down and actually read this. So I'm more likely to absorb that and think about what I'm reading, whereas online I'm just like, okay, yep, I skim, yep, I've got the gist of it. What's the next headline? What's the next headline? Like, I've become so inundated with it, and it just feels like there's so much news out there that is just bombarding me that it's almost like there are times where I feel like, okay, I need a break. It's too much of a bad thing, and I'm not really getting anything positive out of it because I'm just taking in the very basic information and not really thinking about what I'm reading. I'm just trying to get the gist of it, I guess.
Yeah, again, it's the jet skier versus the scuba diver.
Yes.
That metaphor. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we're all doing a little bit of both. And I think it's important to step away and have, take a break from Twitter, sort of, to Megan's point, but to sort of really be honest about what we can handle in terms of our lives. And, we have other things to do as well. So how do we craft a thoughtful media diet, if you will? So, what's that?
I never read anything in print, really.
Really?
Just about never. It's pretty
Never?
much all on my phone or a computer. And it'll be both. It'll be sort of skimming headlines, or I will read an in-depth article, but I do all of that on my phone or online.
Oh, that's interesting.
I just don't even paper magazines and newspapers. I don't even have them around. They're not really.
Yeah, they're just not a part of your physical universe anymore.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah. When I'm in airports, I like to watch people reading news. It's really that, and surfing on Tinder. Pretty common. Looking over someone's shoulder is like, oh, that's an interesting choice. But watching people consume news when you're traveling is really interesting, and then sometimes it leads to kind of conversation. But yeah, I think more and more we're moving, in the digital. So what were your sources? I'm curious. So you mentioned The Guardian, The New York Times,
The Post,
and the WashPo.
But I think I was just thinking about it, those are not actually the only sources. I get a lot of stuff, primary sources online, like news releases. So I think I consume more than I think. I'm not as mono as I would represent myself to be.
Nice. Barry, how about you?
I spend a lot of time in the car, so I listen to NPR. VPR a lot. Yeah. I have a subscription to the New Yorker, so those are in the bathroom. And
bathroom news, quality time.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Let's see what else. And because like you, the paper. It's it drives me nuts that we have. It's just magazines, a lot of food magazines, but also I think the New Yorker is
very important news.
Yeah. What else? And then I do spend a lot of time on social media, and I look at news headlines there, and I'm aware that is very curated. There's that, and then there's also some like bloggy aggregators. There's this thing called the Skim.
How many read the Daily Skim?
Yeah, the Daily Skim.
Yeah.
And that's kind of interesting because it's what you were talking about, Melody.
Yes.
Where they kind of serve you up the headlines, and you could take a deeper dive if you want to or not.
And there's an interpretive dimension too to the Daily Skim. It's like, we're going to tell you in a sentence why this is important.
Yeah.
Why Angela Merkel's announcement as the German Chancellor today vis-a-vis the U.S. economy is important. It's almost like so you can like sound really smart at the cocktail party this weekend, right?
Yeah.
We're going to tell you.
And I think I'd do another thing like that, fast forward maybe from the Boston Globe.
Okay.
Which is another interpretive thing.
Yeah.
That comes to me either daily or weekly.
Yeah. So yeah, the Daily Skim is interesting because they give you the story, and then they tell you what to think about the story, or give you some sort of context. Yeah. Anyone else? Sources you go to?
I mean, I listen to VPR, but I'd probably say it's more things like The Daily Show or podcasts.
Yep.
Some more specific, like more focused, and some more general, and much less. I mean, basically never watching the news. And yeah, I used to deliver papers, but I don't know the last time I have read a paper.
I was a newspaper boy as well. Did you have one of those rack traps on your bike where you stacked up the papers and threw them? And
Though a lot of times I'd just walk.
Nice.
So
You
I
had a
deliver
bag?
inside some too for state office complex. So
nice.
couldn't ride the bike in there.
Yeah, they hate that. Nice.
But
Anyone
yeah, I
else?
think
I listen to NPR. I listen to NPR pretty much. That's my main source. My parents listened to it growing up, and I still do. Looked at some of the, like how biased or not are the different news channels, and that one usually comes up as fairly well-rounded, but I still feel like there's some bias, and they have the BBC on there, and that's even a noticeable step sort of removed, less opinion, more like this is like this outside observer, just a little bit more
with a British accent, so it must be true.
Interesting.
It must be true.
And then things like John Oliver Tonight, or those are more like sort of opinion, have more opinion and a definite take on something.
I think it's really appealing too when there's like a comedic value to the news, because it's like, especially
Depressing.
Yeah, yes. It's like, good, there are other people that think this is just as bad as I do, and we're kind of like with SNL, like you have to, if you can't laugh at it once in a while, it's just, it takes over, and it's like, I don't want to get out of bed. I don't want to read the news anymore. I don't want I don't want to be living in this world that I'm living in.
No.
So I think the humor aspect is important.
Nice. Did you want to weigh in?
Oh, pretty much the same as her. Just a lot of VPR, and throughout the day I rarely get a chance to look at the news, so I find it kind of handy getting just headlines on my watch. If it's a really important day, it'll come in on just a headline on my watch. I can see what happened.
Right. So when I do a deep dive on a news story, and I always encourage folks to take news on a story-by-story basis rather than it's VPR as a channel, so it's going to be this way, or it's Fox as a channel, so it's going to be that way, or but to really kind of take it, when you're really kind of got your critical lens on, to really look for those 6 ingredients. I'm trying to think of, so Vermont Digger has a reporter named Jasper Craven who is doing like some really remarkable real news reporting on the F-35 conversation here in Vermont. You know, the Pentagon Joint Strike Fighter that may or may not show up in a year or two. And he's got a really wonderful archive of just some really thoughtful, well-researched, multi-perspectival, historically grounded news about it. And whenever anyone asked me about the F-35, I was like, go there, because he's the guy on this, because he's really dug into it. So you know, to find different news sources and people who are covering issues that you care about, like CCTV is all about like local political races, right? So if you really want to know about the candidates who are running for office, this is a great source for that. So.
Well, and now if you want to know anything going on with the opioid crisis, we have so many people doing shows on that
Yeah.
topic.
Yeah.
It's really interesting that you get these different perspectives on that particular issue that you wouldn't, that are community-based perspectives.
Yeah.
Interesting.
How do you know when you can, like you talk about knowing that it's reliable, but how do you know what sources you can trust and which ones you can't?
I think, again, I think it varies on a story-by-story basis. I mean, certainly we can all sort of cite certain ideological parameters for certain news sources, but I think it's a much more interesting exercise to kind of take each story that you may be interested in and ask yourself, all right, does it kind of check off these boxes, right? Is it recent, is it relevant, is it reliable, are there many points of view here, is there some historical context? And you can actually pretty quickly tell if that's what's going on. And if it meets those criteria, it's like, okay, so this is actually like a useful news story, as opposed to disinformation or a piece of propaganda or, you know, an ideologically driven opinion piece disguised as a news story, you know, or some kind of algorithmic bot slinging random information from some anonymous fake account somewhere.
Is that Rush Limbaugh?
Well, oddly, you know, I do a lot of, I've taken a lot of news via YouTube, like subscriptions to various channels, and Tucker Carlson, the bow tie wearing Fox anchor, like out of nowhere, like he's been doing some really pretty great reporting, like fairly critical of U.S. imperial policy in the Middle East of late. I'm like, where's this coming from? Like, I never would have thought Tucker Carlson would do that. And it's, you know, it's an opinion piece, but it's like, it's interesting to see it coming from Fox. Anyway.
I thought it was interesting to watch the footage of Saudi television on the Khashoggi disappearance, murder, and how they were framing it versus, you know, every U.S. coverage.
Yeah.
It was very different.
It is, and that's another great, like in the age of the global net, right, to be able to look at how other countries, other state-sponsored news agencies cover stories of mutual interest. Yeah. Which is one of the biggest problems, I think, with this Facebook, you know, so-called fake news purging. Like, we're not going to listen to Iran anymore. We're not going to listen to North Korean news anymore. We're not going to listen now. It's suspect. It's like, really? It's like remember Al Jazeera? Like Burlington, Vermont was like the only city in the United States where you could actually watch the most popular Arab news channel in the region. Right. It's like I travel in the Middle East. I ask every Arab I meet. It's like, what's your favorite news source? I never had an Arab once tell me it wasn't Al Jazeera. We're going to shut that off, really? And Al Jazeera actually does great international news coverage, like multiple points of view, and it's like, wow, we could actually learn something from this.
Did you see the recent article in 7 Days about the guy writing for the Russian?
Yes, I did see that.
So will you talk about that in that context?
Yeah.
He was called out as being
a Russian,
dangerous.
Yeah, sort of a Russian agent.
By somebody up at UVM.
Yeah, so I don't know much about that guy, but I did read that story, and it was interesting. But so related story. So I don't know if any of you watch or listen to the news platform RT, which is Russia Today. All of the great U.S. investigative news journalists who can't get on U.S. news shows anymore are now going to RT for critical coverage of U.S., particularly foreign policy, but domestic policy too. The best example I can think of is Chris Hedges, who won a Pulitzer Prize as a New York Times foreign correspondent covering al-Qaeda terrorist cells in Europe, and then spoke out against the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 and was threatened with job loss by the New York Times for delivering a speech at a college commencement in Illinois, and then he decided to quit the New York Times rather than, you know, get fired, essentially. And he's gone on to write, I don't know, 6 or 7 or 8 books about kind of our current economic and political situation, but he cannot get a voice on U.S. news outlets. So he has his own show on RT. And I've sent stuff to friends of mine in the States, and they're like, well, he's on RT, you can't trust him. It's like, this is one of the most thoughtful, well-read, well-researched U.S. reporters we have ever produced in this country. And you're going to render a judgment on his reporting because he's on RT. That seems problematic to me.
Yeah.
Very different than this other guy, who I don't know much about.
Kind of.
Kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I don't use writing about gentrification in the Old North End, and it was getting picked up
Yeah.
by a Russian newspaper that had been kicked off of Facebook for being deemed a propaganda arm.
Right.
And it was interesting because I thought 10 years ago, nobody would have blinked an eye at his writing for this. But
Yeah.
in this current,
In this context,
Yeah.
where Russia is sort of the new enemy again. Yeah. Yeah, so maybe let's come back around to that, because I think it's important. Anybody else want to talk about, did anyone else see that story in 7 Days? Another great local news source, by the way. Right, award-winning alt weekly. So I wanted to take just a couple of minutes and lay out, as we think about sort of the real deal about fake news, to lay out the argument that Noam Chomsky and Ed Herman made in their book Manufacturing Consent about why we get the news we get in the United States, and then kind of layer on some digital thoughts about that, and then it won't take me but a few moments. But is that okay? Can we jump in there? So has anyone read Manufacturing Consent? Looks like this. The Political Economy, the Mass Medium.
A while ago.
A while ago, yeah. So just a bit of background. So this book was first published in 1988 by HarperCollins, I believe. And it's since been republished twice. And Noam Chomsky, of course, renowned linguist and political philosopher, you know, kind of a lefty, fairly radical. Now, I think retired, is now teaching in Arizona, left MIT. And Ed Herman, who used to be the dean of the communications school, I think in Annenberg, right? University of Pennsylvania.
Great.
Yeah, and so what they did in Manufacturing Consent was to take the New York Times' coverage of domestic and foreign policy and do kind of a deep dive and analysis of how the Times covered a number of hot issues in the 70s and 80s, the Vietnam War, for example, the kind of the emerging, what we would call now the neoliberal economy, and then try and figure out, like, why did we end up with the news we ended up with in the New York Times? And they said, look, it's not about intrepid journalists, individual journalists doing courageous journalism work, although that happens, right? This is more of like a systemic approach. Like, why do we get the news we get in the New York Times and other news outlets like the Washington Post, the TV networks, what have you? And so the conclusion they came to is that the nature of news production in the U.S., and it is a production, it's an industry, it's manufactured, right? And the word consent means sort of agreement. So the title of the book literally means like how U.S. news is manufactured to produce kind of agreement for certain U.S. domestic and foreign policy goals, broadly speaking, right? How does that happen? And what they said was the reason we get the news we do is because our news industry is what they call the guided market system. You have business and political actors, organizations, and elites, for lack of a better term, who are kind of working loosely together, not in a conspiratorial way, but kind of all kind of operating in the same economic and political circles to produce certain news stories in certain ways at the expense of others, other news stories in other ways. So, and what they proposed was that you could understand how this works by thinking about all raw information in the U.S. having to pass through a series of news, they use the word filters, news filters before it came out on the other side on the pages of the New York Times or the Washington Post or on ABC or NBC or CBS, right, or PBS, right, the four big networks back in the late 80s. So the 5 filters they suggested kind of helped kind of filter and shape U.S. news were these. Number one, they talked about the role of advertising. You know, advertising is the lifeblood of our news culture, right? And as the old saying goes, he who pays the piper calls the tune, right? So advertisers are very powerful players within news spaces, and they have particular stories that they want covered and particular stories they don't. And so advertising dollars plays a role in shaping or filtering certain kinds of news at the expense of others. And this, by the way, is not just true of the U.S., right? This is true of lots of other countries as well. But this is the argument that Chomsky and Herman made. The second filter they argued was the ownership filter. So news organizations are for-profit corporate commercial entities, most of them. And they are owned often by larger corporate actors. So asking the ownership question and appreciating how ownership works as a filter was like the second way to think about how this guided market system worked, to kind of allow certain news stories through the filter, but kind of trap other ones. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So think about the ownership filter. And I'll give you an example, a couple of examples in a minute. The third filter they talked about was what they called news makers, people and organizations who by their kind of high profile status, by virtue of that status, were always sort of covered as important news. Like Barack Obama cleaned his sock drawer today with his kitten boots, right? Front page news, just because it was the president, right? So he's a news maker, right? You know, the press, the U.S. press dutifully reports, you know, Trump's every tweet, whether it's newsworthy or not, right? And I remember the first time the New York Times put a Trump tweet on the front page right after the election. I was like, we're doomed. Like if we're gonna make the micro blogging of the president at 2:30 in the morning a front page news story, that's somehow newsworthy, we're in trouble. The fourth filter they talked about was a filter they called news shapers. And news shapers are organizations like think tanks or foundations or PR firms who are literally paid to be in the business of manufacturing public relations and passing it off as news. Like if you talk to people who work in the PR firms, they'll tell you that the best public relations is invisible public relations. So you look at the front page of the New York Times. We're going to pick on the Times because that's what Chomsky and Herman did. So we'll stay with the Times for a minute. Like you can look at the front page of the New York Times, and you can, if you know a little bit about U.S. history and kind of the way this filter works, you can pretty quickly tell like which stories were probably kind of massaged or planted there, just because of the way they're framed. And again, if you come back to those 6 elements of real news, you can pretty quickly tell, all right, this clearly has sort of like this is like a one-sided news story. So that's like, kind of tips me off that this maybe is not a genuine news story, that this might be like there might be some news shapers at work here. And then the final filter they talked about was what they called flack, or negative criticism. So if you're a reporter or a news organization that kind of strays outside the boundaries of acceptable discourse, right? You criticize someone or some organization like, oh, I don't know, the Pentagon, that shouldn't be criticized, then you're going to get a phone call or a letter. Or you're going to get some kind of campaign launched against you in social media channels. Or your editor or your publisher is going to get that phone call or that. You know, the Chris Hedges example is a perfect example. Right? Chris Hedges had every right as a U.S. journalist to go and give a commencement speech in which he critiqued the U.S. invasion of Iraq, if that's what he wanted to do, in a allegedly sort of free country. But the Times said, no, we're getting flack, we're getting negative criticism about that. So we're going to essentially ask you not to do that anymore, Chris, or you're going to lose your job. So that's how flack works, right? So those are the 5 filters that they talked about in manufacturing consent, the political economy of the mass media. And that, again, was the late 1980s and then into kind of the 1990s. So let me pause there for a minute and ask you any reactions or questions or thoughts about any of those before we go on to the next 5 filters, the digital age. And they called this, by the way, the propaganda model of news, the way in which news was kind of manufactured to be more one-sided and persuasive than less, right? And this is where I sort of, I reread this book a couple of years ago. I was asked by some mutual friends of ours out in California at Project Censored to take the Chomsky-Herman propaganda model of news model and bring it up to speed for the digital age. Like, how would we kind of reinvent the model as we move from analog to digital? So I said, yeah, I got nothing else to do. Let me work on that. So a year later, I wrote this book chapter and kind of came up with sort of some additional filters. But I went back and I reread the whole book. I was like, oh man, it's a really important book. And the other interesting thing about this book is that even in scholarly communications and media journals, scholars who devote their professional lives over decades to understanding how communications and news production work, you rarely find mention of the propaganda model of news by Chomsky and Herman. Like, I think someone did a study, like in 10 years of communications journals, it was mentioned like 1.2% of the time in all the articles, and usually just with a footnote. Like, it wasn't actually applied as an analytical tool. So I teach the propaganda model in my news and journalism classes at the University of Vermont, and I just asked my students, I said, look, let me just lay this out for you, and then you tell me what you think. Does it make sense? And we kind of get into it. And about halfway through the semester, like, yeah, this actually, I see how this works, like as a conceptual way to understand why we get the news we do. Do you want to jump in, Audrey?
Well, I was going to say, Chomsky really influenced us when we started CCTV, him and Michael Parenti.
Michael Parenti, yeah.
Who also writes about these things in the same way. And when we did the Media Makers series in the 80s, we did these interviews, 1 hour long interviews with media makers, and that never happened at the time. But we were sort of armed with this theory. And we went to these media makers, some of them were like publishers, some of them were reporters, and we said, well, do you think you're influenced by the structure of the media? And it just wasn't an idea that was commonly held. No one thought they were. Like, no one questioned the water they were swimming in, whereas now people talk about this.
Yeah.
Right? But so that's good that we do talk about this, but it took some time.
It did, yeah. And just kind of to lay another sort of helpful concept onto this, the sociologists talk about what they call structure and agency. Individual journalists are agents working in news spaces, and so they go out and they find stories they think are important for people to know about, and then they research them and write about them and try and publish them. So journalists are agents, but these agents have to work within larger structures of power that may afford them both opportunities and limitations, boundaries on what individual journalists are allowed to talk about. So this concept of like structure and agency kind of fits nicely with the filters, because I mentioned, the Jasper Craven F-35 example. Like, Vermont Digger has given Jasper Craven a platform to really ask some hard questions about whether or not we should stick this Joint Strike Fighter in the middle of a 3-city urban area, given everything we know about the plane and its safety record and its environmental impact and blah, blah, blah. And it's to Digger's credit, I think, that they've done that, because it's a fairly controversial story. It's got the support of our most powerful senator, Leahy, right, who actually went to the U.S. Air Force and said, we want the planes in Burlington. The Air Force is like, we don't think we actually should put them there. It doesn't make much sense. And Leahy's like, we want the planes here. And Craven writes about all this. It's really interesting. And again, multiple points of view, and different sort of the conversation within the Air Force and supporters and detractors and the plane and the politics of it, and it's really interesting. And you read it and you're like, oh, that's what a real news story smells like. That's real news, thank God, right? And you realize when you apply that 6-element definition, how rare real news can be, right? We're blessed in Vermont with like an embarrassment of riches, right? TV and radio and independent local news papers that I think do their best to try and serve up real news, but it's the exception, not to get too boutiquey about Vermont, but you want to jump in, Ollie?
I think I'm aware of these factors, at least vaguely, and it's what makes me more distrustful of the news. But it seems like it's so pervasive that where do you go to get
we're just warming
things
up.
that are influenced by that? And and like the multiple perspectives, and there are certain things that make a news story feel better, but even when it seems better than maybe some of what's out there, is it really the best, most unbiased reporting you can get, and where can you really go for that? It still seems hard to find.
It is hard to find, yeah. And again, I think story by story, case by case is best, right? And you'll find people like Jasper Craven is my go-to for F-35 stuff. Like, as you develop sort of an understanding of the issues that really matter to you in your local, state, national, whatever, you will seek out and find the voices that you think are doing their best to give you that kind of real news approach, not just serving up propaganda. And again, Jasper Craven is my go-to on this because I've just been reading a lot of his stuff lately because I'm interested in this F-35 thing. So did someone in the back, you guys want to jump in? Or?
I just have,
I don't know, I guess that's just kind of getting under my skin a little bit, because I feel like in the United States we're very much brag about the right to free speech. And the more I feel like we hear about the media and the money behind it, and it just seems like we can't, it seems very hypocritical, because if you are someone that wants to be a journalist for mainstream media and you don't curtail to, you know, if you're not willing to push what they're selling, basically, you really have to seek it out. And the average American is not, I hope that's happening more, but I feel like the average American is not going to spend the time to question that and to seek out, you know, these smaller, more independent, unbiased opinions. And so if you do kind of clash with something that the government is doing, the average American doesn't seem like they're going to know that, because they're just being kind of spoon-fed what mainstream media says. So how can you say, oh yes, we have all this great free speech, but it's really like down at this level? It's not, it's not in anyone's face. You really have to look for it.
And what you just said was like the perfect summary of like Chomsky and Herman's point in the book, right? Manufacturing consent. It's like the news is in the business not of providing you with multiple perspectives to sort of give you kind of more critical information. It's about the news. Like literally, like we're producing stories that build agreement for certain positions.
So maybe in other countries you would, this is extreme, maybe you would get tossed in jail for writing a story like this, but how is it, the only difference feels like, okay, so you don't get tossed in jail, but you're going to lose your job. You're not going to be able to really move up the ladder. You're not going to be able to fulfill everything that you want to do. So you're still kind of being punished in one way or another. Yeah, you have to seek alternative venues to sort of get the news out. Chris Hedges is a good example. Like he's written, you know, several best-selling books, you know, kind of doing journalism work, but as an independent researcher and publisher rather than a New York Times reporter. And arguably, maybe he's reaching more people now. I don't know. He's on a book tour right now. He's been all over the country. But it seems like it takes a failure of that proportion to really show up on people's radar. Yeah. And to be fair, you know, if my Chinese friends were in the room, are like, oh gosh, you know, America's way better than China when it comes to like this stuff, right? And there's an old joke in Russia. It's like, you know, the only difference between Russians and Americans is when the Russian government issues a press release, the Russians don't believe it. Right? So, you know, in totalitarian or one-party, you know, police states like Russia and China, you know, everyone's like, yeah, it's okay. That's what the party's going to say, right? That's what Pravda is going to say. That's what Xinhua out of Beijing is going to say, and we're going to take to you know, social media and, you know, kind of complicate things. Whereas in the U.S., right, there is this sense of like, well, you know, we're so free and open. This couldn't possibly be going on, or maybe it does sometimes, right? But. And what Chomsky and Herman did was like they took this kind of liberal bastion, right, the New York Times, and said, you know, even at the Times, based on our analysis of, you know, years and years of reporting on these important news stories, you see these filters at work. And again, they're just talking about the Times, so let's be clear about that, right? They're not talking about, you know, any other news source. All right, so let's jump into the digital age. Let me throw these at you and see what you think and see what you make of them. So this is where I sort of had to sort of figure out, like, all right, so how would I bring the propaganda model of news up into the digital age? And so I came up with another 5 filters based on kind of my work and research, and so I'll just throw these out there and we can talk about them. So the 6th filter is what I call the deep state disinformation filter. And I want to be clear, by deep state, I'm not having like an Alex Jones moment here. You know, he's fond of using the term deep state, but there's an entire sort of scholarly body of literature around the construction of the deep state. Peter Dale Scott, who's a historian out of Canada, who's written, I don't know, 12 books about the deep state. The deep state simply refers to unelected federal organizations and agencies that kind of do their work humming along in D.C. regardless of whether it's a liberal or a conservative in the White House and Congress, the Supreme Court, whatever. So, you know, good examples of deep state agencies would be the Pentagon, right, which has for 20 years now declared that the full spectrum dominance of Earth and outer space is their stated goal, right? That's what the Pentagon wants, control the Earth,
right? Or the CIA, right, the Central Intelligence Agency, or the NSA, which, you know, Edward Snowden sort of told us all about when he, you know, shanghaied information and took it to Hong Kong. So that's what we mean by the deep state. And the deep state, these unelected organizations, the CIA is sort of a good one to mention, often enjoy some very cozy relationships with some very high-profile news organizations and journalists and editors and publishers. The best example I can give you, and you should look this up, it's an interesting story, is what was called in the 1960s and 70s Operation Mockingbird, which was a CIA effort to partner with hundreds of news organizations and editors around the country to promote an aggressive U.S. invasion and then takeover of Vietnam. And if you saw the movie The Post with Steven Spielberg and Meryl Streep, it's a fascinating movie. How many of you saw The Post? Yeah, it's worth watching. You know, it's Steven Spielberg, so it's beautiful and romantic and wonderfully shot, and I felt really good at the end of it, except, right, the movie sort of purports that The Post kind of saved the day with the Times by publishing Daniel Ellsberg's Pentagon Papers and blowing the whistle on the kind of two-party corruption of the Vietnam War. But the reality is that the Post and the Times were in bed with the CIA for years, promoting the U.S. invasion and occupation of Vietnam before things got really ugly. And then they're like, all right, after 10 years of doing this, Operation Mockingbird stuff, you know, working with the deep state, the CIA, to kind of promote this agenda, if you will, through this filter. It's like, yeah, we think the U.S. invasion of Vietnam is a great idea, and here's why. We're going to tell you all about it for 10 years. They kind of came to their senses when Ellsberg, you know, absconded with the Pentagon Papers, and then they blew the whistle. So it's a complicated story, and Spielberg kind of, you know, puts it in glowing kind of Hollywood terms. But so the deep state filter is very real, and these unelected organizations, you know, work behind the scenes to kind of massage, as the British like to say, massage news and information in particular ways. Now we get into sort of the age of the digital. Here comes the internet. And if I can make this, yeah, I love this mouse
There's
here.
a mouse on the side.
Oh, there's a mouse, I see it. Oh yeah, so here's George Seldes, who's a great progressive muckraking journalist 100 years ago. Journalism's job is not impartial, balanced reporting. Journalism's job is to tell the people what is really going on. I like that. It's kind of an activist point of view, but as long as we're telling the people what's going on with the definition of real news, right, I'm all about it. So, filter number 7 is algorithms. An algorithm, as you probably know, is simply a code written by computer programmers to solve a particular problem. How are we going to move all this information, this digital data around the Facebook platform? Mark Zuckerberg hires his team of algorithmic coders. They do the thing, right? The insidious thing about algorithms, these codes, is that they're produced behind the scenes, they're proprietary, and they're always changing, and we never know when or why. So when Facebook and Google announced last year, we're going to sort of, in the name of fighting fake news, we're going to take, we're just going to sort of figure out which of these news organizations are suspect, and we're just going to kind of recode the algorithm to divert traffic away from Alternet and Truthdig and Truthout and Common Dreams and Black Agenda Report and all those U.S. news sources that are critical of, U.S. imperial activity abroad, for example. And we're not going to tell anybody that we're doing this. And one day, Truthdig and Truthout and all the ones I just mentioned all woke up and looked at their algorithmic numbers, and they watched their readership online drop off a cliff. Like, where'd everybody go? Like, yesterday it was up here, and today it's down here. What happened? And they all started talking to each other, and then Google's like, oh yeah, we just, massaged the algorithm. And decided that you guys don't sort of fit the bill online anymore.
Wow.
So I call that in the book chapter algorithmic censorship.
Yeah.
Right? We change computer codes without telling anybody to divert traffic away from news and information sites that we deem suspect. And Facebook just did this again, like 3 days ago. Right? They had the biggest purge of Facebook news channels, including a number of US news channels they've had in like a year.
Wow.
And apparently they're being advised by an organization called the Atlantic Council.
Oh, good.
Which is made up of people like Henry Kissinger. Perhaps you remember Henry Kissinger from the 70s.
Yeah.
You actually should read about this. Matt Taibbi, who's a wonderful journalist, writes for Rolling Stone, just did a big piece about this a week or two ago before Facebook announced their latest algorithmic purge. So that's how algorithms work as a filter, right? We're going to kind of reprogram the codes delivering information around the internet on social media platforms, and Google's doing the same thing. We're not going to tell anybody really what's going on there.
What's the analog equivalent?
Yeah, that's a great question, Megan. What would the analog equivalent of? I think that would be, well, no, that doesn't quite work. I thought about another digital example, but I think that would be, the analog equivalent would be the editor at the New York Times saying to his reporting staff, all right, here's a list of 5 stories you're not allowed to cover, and we're not going to tell anybody. Right? I mean, that's a rough equivalent.
Is it like Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting did a study at the Times, and when they chose to use the word guerrilla to refer to freedom fighters in Nicaragua.
Yeah, or my new favorite in Syria.
Is that the same thing, or is that?
Well, I think that's Orwellian use of language. I think what's so insidious about the algorithm it's a systemic reprogramming of digital information sharing or not sharing, rather than focusing on a particular language choices or story coverage or lack thereof. I mean, it's really insidious because these are private for-profit companies, Facebook, Google, so we have no recourse really other than breaking them up, through federal legislation or regulation.
It would be like certain magazines or newspapers disappearing from the newsstand.
Ooh.
And no one really knew why.
That's a nice example.
All of a sudden, we don't have that magazine anymore.
Yeah, that's a really good example. Yeah, so you go down to Burlington, right, and tomorrow, and 7 Days has disappeared from all the newsstands.
Oh yeah, we decided you can't have access to that.
Yeah, those 7 Days people, they're kind of artsy.
Yeah.
They're a little radical.
Down the edge.
On the edge. Not Pamela Apollo. No more 7 Days. We're not going to tell you why.
Right.
Yeah, and there's no sort of public announcement about it either. It's just like, it's just gone.
Well, and there's no transparency about the editorial decision.
Right.
Because it's driven by those other factors.
Right. So to be clear, you can still go to Truth Out and Truth Dig and Common Dreams. They're still on the internet, but when you search for them in the search categories, they've been kind of marginalized, pushed to the edge because of the way the search engine optimization codes, algorithms are programmed. It's an interesting case study.
Can they do anything to fix that themselves?
Well, so there's been a lot of talk about that. Like, what do? You could maybe file a lawsuit. You have to be able to prove it, which means you have to have access to the algorithmic codes, which is proprietary information. But they do have, as all good organizations do, they do track their numbers in real time of visitor hits and that sort of thing. So I think they have a pretty strong case. But yeah, how do you?
Can't they optimize themselves?
I think they can, in the broader sort of internet space, they can boost search engine optimization keywords and things like that on a per page basis. But within the world of Google and Facebook, no, because those again are their own ecosystems programmed out of Silicon Valley.
Yeah,
so.
it's true. Yeah.
So the 8th filter goes hand in hand with algorithmic censorship, but it's the filter bubble. How many know this term? It's, so the term was popularized by the founder of MoveOn.org, Ellie Pariser, who now runs Upworthy.com, which is like a nice little daily news channel. Gives you like 3 inspirational videos delivered to your email box. Anybody get Upworthy at all? Yeah. So Eli Pariser, what he did, how he discovered the filter bubble is an interesting story. He has a nice little TED Talk about it, but he basically, one day he had 2 friends with different political views open up their computers and go to Google and search the term Arab Spring, and then looked at what came up on their Google search feeds, and he noticed like the liberal guy and the conservative guy got completely different search results for the same term, Arab Spring, and Pariser's like, how is that possible? And then what he came to realize, as we are now learning, is that as the web gets smarter and aggregates our own individual search decisions around news and information, it makes decisions for us about what we think is important when we do searches, right? So I search Arab Spring online, I'm going to get a different sort of list of stories based on what I have searched in the past. Whereas if Karen does the same thing, Arab Spring, you're going to get a different sort of search result. So he called this the filter bubble. And the filter bubble is something that we do to ourselves as news consumers over time by continuing to kind of go back to the same wells, sources of information for our news. And here's something we can do something about, right? We can push against our filter bubbles by going out beyond our sort of zone of comfort and going to different news sites we might not otherwise consult. And this again is where dialogue is important. It's like get some other political points of view and just hold them up to the light, you know? And if you do that over time, you can kind of keep your bubble from kind of closing in on you. You can keep from being wrapped, right? Like saran in the same sort of news and information sources that we get over time. Did you want to jump in here?
How do you sort of, I feel like just as people, we kind of gravitate towards news that has the same bias that we have, or has the same opinion that we have.
It's a phenomenon called, you may have heard this term, confirmation bias.
So how do
you go to news sources that confirm what we already think we know.
Yes. So how do you, I mean, is that something you can break out of without really even, if you don't make a conscious thought or effort to do that, you're kind of going to continue to stay in that bubble forever.
You are, and it's particularly, I think, insidious with our news choices because, as we talked about earlier, right, so much of our news consumption is habitual, and we like to go back to news sources and that we think are trusted, if you will.
I mean, isn't it? I feel like part of it is just human nature to feel like, okay, like this is, these people have the same viewpoint I do. We kind of put ourselves into these groups of people that this is, they believe the same thing that I believe. So how do you kind of have the conscious thought that, okay, maybe this is just me finding what I want to hear instead of what might actually really be happening?
Well, you just answered your own question. I like that. You said it takes conscious thought, and it also takes a bit of courage, because to kind of complicate your thinking about anything, to step outside of what it is we think we know, let's be honest, it's hard to do that, right? On anything, really. And yet, if you want to sort of fight the filter bubble, we must try. And let me put these two together for you, algorithms and filter bubbles, because these two work together in some pretty interesting ways as well. What we're learning about YouTube search and Google search, particularly YouTube now, is that YouTube, which of course is owned by Google. YouTube is the second most popular search engine in the world behind Google. Think about that for a minute. But what's happening on YouTube is the way that YouTube has programmed its algorithm, its code, is that it serves up more extreme content of the same stuff you say you want. So if you're a Bernie Sanders guy and you're looking at Bernie Sanders videos on YouTube, YouTube's going to send you even more extreme Bernie Sanders videos over time. And if you're a Trump person, you're going to get more extreme, if this is possible, more extreme versions of Trump over time. So the YouTube algorithm is actually programmed to further polarize and divide us simply by delivering us more extreme versions of what we say we want, courtesy of the filter bubble. So think about how those two things work together. It's kind of mind-blowing, right?
Well, I feel like it makes it even harder to break out of it.
It does. It does. So we hear a lot about sort of the polarizing of the U.S. electorate, right? And this isn't helping.
No,
right? In terms of like pushing people to cross conversational and ideological divides. So we have to sort of get our head around the algorithm and get our head around the filter bubbles. Now, it gets even more interesting. Yeah, jump in, Megan.
Sorry. So I don't doubt you, but I'm curious how you know that.
So yeah, there's a wonderful TED talk given by a wonderful Turkish-American scholar. Her name is Tefnik, help me out. You know her? She wrote Twitter and Tear Gas.
I didn't know her.
Oh, she's a wonderful thinker. Yeah. So she actually has. She sat down with the YouTube algorithmic programmers and had this conversation with them, and then she gives this really wonderful talk. It's just a few months ago where she sort of talks about how this works. And to be clear, what YouTube and Facebook and Google will all say is, look, we're simply in the business of delivering you more of what you say you want. Right? So if you want more Bernie Sanders videos, we can help, right? And of course, underpinning that is the commercial imperative, sort of more click-through and more data collection and more surveillance and all of the stuff that all these social media platforms are about, right? So they're simply sort of saying, look, in the name of like getting to know you better and giving you what you want, we're just programming our platforms to do what we think is best. But the flip side of that is this polarization and this kind of, further.
Multiple searches.
So Yeah, so what some of the tech visionaries like Jaron Lanier, who is one of the inventors of virtual reality, have been saying is like, yeah, we need to reprogram stuff. Like, and we need to reprogram ourselves, right? For starters, we need to sort of push ourselves as individual news consumers and information seekers to push beyond these. But we also have to kind of reinvent algorithms that kind of push us into shared, thoughtful, conversational spaces with people who don't think like we do, or who don't feel like we do. And that's kind of terrifying to some people, but the alternative is like to continue to go down this road, right? So I think there's multiple solutions, but we have to kind of get a handle on like how this all works, which is why we kind of came up with these filters. So let me do two more, and then so the ninth filter. This is the filter that kind of blew up in the public mind after the Cambridge Analytica Facebook debacle of last year, and I predicted this was going to happen fully a year before it did. I wrote about it at Vermont Independent. I told my UVM students about it. We watched Cambridge Analytica CEO Alexander Nix brag on YouTube about how Cambridge Analytica had 5,000 individual data points on 220 million American voters that they had purchased from third-party algorithmic and data harvesting corporations. And Cambridge Analytica took all of this information and kind of pulled it into a giant database, and then went to Steve Bannon and the Trump campaign and said, look, we can work with the Trump campaign if you're willing to pay us. They started with Rubio, then he fell out of the race, right, in summer of 2016. So they said to Trump, and Trump, you know, whether you love him or hate him, he ran a very strategic social media outreach campaign on Facebook and Twitter. The Clintonistas ran the other direction. They went back to TV, and the Trump people were like, we don't really have any idea what we're doing. So when Mark Zuckerberg offered Facebook employees to be embedded with the Trump campaign, they're like, sounds good to us. So what they were doing is behavioral micro-targeting, looking at these 5,000 data points on these key niche groups around the country of American voters who are on the fence, and then sending specifically targeted Facebook and Twitter messages to these undecided niche groups to try and persuade them to vote in favor of Trump. And this came to be called behavioral micro-targeting. And the insidious thing here is that Cambridge Analytica harvested tens of millions of people's data through Facebook and a backdoor in a Facebook program without anybody's knowledge or permission. So that's why it was sort of kind of blew up. And if you haven't seen Christopher Wiley's whistleblowing interview about this that The Guardian did in the months after the election, he was that red-haired, glasses-wearing Canadian programmer who was working at Cambridge Analytica outside of London when Steve Bannon showed up one day, and then sort of got religion after the election. It was like, what did we just do? He's the one who kind of blew up the story on behavioral micro-targeting. So, and this is just going to get more and more sophisticated. You know, Cambridge Analytica has said they've closed their doors. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't, but that data is still out there.
So, you know, the Attorney General has been charged with coming up with some legislation about protecting people against the collection of this data by internet service providers.
This is our Attorney General or TJ Donovan?
Yeah, so the legislature, they just passed a data brokers bill, but this is now they're considering writing up a bill related to ISPs. And the ISPs, the internet service providers like Comcast, are saying, oh, we don't need any special legislation because we're not involved in this, when in fact, these, you know, they have companies that they basically take their data that they collect in the set-top box and they sell it to their other arm, which then does the micro-targeting.
Yeah.
So it's absurd what they're saying, but this legislation's in place, so there's an opportunity to influence that.
Why aren't people more pissed off?
Well,
about
so, and
this?
again, Megan mentioned this earlier, so whenever we jump on a social media platform, we sign the EULA, the End User License Agreement, which is all that legalese and that opt-in thing that you check because you just want to get on Facebook. Right. And John Oliver, I have mixed feelings about John Oliver, but he's funny on this. He's like, you know what? We could put the text of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf in the EULA, and people would sign it because like, I just want to get on Instagram. I just want on Twitter. I don't care what that says, right? It's all legalese to me, right? And you know, I actually do an exercise in my class where we read the End User License Agreement out loud, and my students are like, what? essentially you're giving permission, right? Legal permission for all of these social media platforms to take every single keystroke you ever make on their platform and commercialize it and commodify it. So that's where behavioral market targeting began. And now the Europeans are kind of leading the charge on this stuff. They're passing in a number of European countries. I think it's just about to drop a fairly rigorous, for the time anyway, Data Privacy Act.
It passed, yeah.
Yeah,
In
just
the
passed. It's called the
European
General
Yeah.
I forget.
It's got
Yeah.
a lot of initials, but
It does.
but essentially it's an opt-in. It's an opt-in system.
Yeah.
So you have to formally be asked and say yes.
Yeah.
I'm going to do those things.
Right, rather than an opt-out.
Right.
Yeah. So you actually have to kind of read the fine print before you check the box, rather than just,
Right.
yeah, the other way around. So from a news and information perspective too, what was so insidious about behavioral microtargeting is that a lot of these kind of strategic, often very emotionally related messages to these individual voters were kind of cast as coming from friends in the social network or colleagues, or so you get this thing about, well, you really want to vote for this person or that person, and not really understanding where it was where it was originating from. So it's my favorite. The final filter is what's called sock puppets, or you've probably heard the term bots. And these are anonymous, sometimes fake, sometimes hybrid, sometimes real, but shanghaied social media accounts that are deployed in social media spaces to support or attack a particular candidate or news story or position. I mentioned the Chinese government uses sock puppets all the time to kind of divert attention away from controversies in Chinese social media. The US government is doing more and more of this. Both the Clinton and the Trump campaigns used sock puppets by the thousands in the months leading up to the 2016 election. Vladimir Putin and the Russians get all the blame for sock puppets. The Russians spent about $200,000 equivalent on social media memes, half of which was after the election by mistake in these so-called troll farms outside of Moscow. The Democrats and the Republican parties both spent far more money and far more strategic time on deploying these sock puppets to kind of blow up or attack or support Trump or Clinton or whoever it was. And again, this is just going to get more and more sophisticated. I like to remind my students that all those celebrities with 10 million followers on Instagram have paid third-party corporations to literally manufacture and then pump up their Instagram numbers with millions of fake accounts from people who don't even exist. It's so bizarre.
Truly.
True. Yeah. In fact, there was just a story, might have been in the Times a couple days ago. You got to take the Times with a grain of salt, right? But something, I forget what it was, but some millions of Trump's Twitter followers are actually sock puppets. They're actually not real. And of course, the Times would say that about Trump because they don't like him. But I'm sure you could probably say that about just about anybody who's got lots of social media accounts following them. Anyway, so these filters, so sock puppets and behavioral micro-targeting and the filter bubbles and algorithms, the deep state disinformation, all of these are kind of hallmarks of the digital age. These are new filters that we kind of have to contend with. And I sort of see it as sort of an interesting and exciting challenge. And to me, I come back to the solutions. I know we just have a few minutes left, but it's really to sort of seek out news and information sources that are adopting that kind of 6-element approach to real news. Like, is this a story that has multiple points of view, and I can see where the source information is coming from, and there's some talk of history and power relations here, and it seems like the information is credible rather than kind of a one-sided piece or whatever. So that's sort of a summary of the propaganda model of news for the digital age. And we've been publishing this information and pushing it out to teachers and professors around North America. I'm presenting this at a national conference in San Francisco next week. For a bunch of independent journalists and teachers and students in the Bay Area. And we've got a bunch of free tools online about this stuff. But this is we live in interesting times, right? As my Chinese friends like to say, and that's both a challenge and an opportunity for news. So
I think,
yeah.
can I just say one
Yeah,
thing
please, I'm
about
done.
the deep state disinformation?
Yeah.
I think it's really fascinating. I think they've been quite successful because what's so interesting is how sympathetic we all are now to the deep state. Like they're kind of a persecuted party within American government, and that the CIA and that we kind of like the CIA and we're kind of rooting for the people that run the FBI, and there's kind of this kind of switch that's been happening, which in my deepest, darkest thinking, I feel like we're being kind of buttered up and softened up for the military to take over and for us to go, yay, the military, thank God. But I think they've been quite successful.
I'm really glad you said it. I watch a lot of fictionalized predictive programming on Netflix. If you've never seen a show, for example, called Quantico, which is now in its 3rd season with a beautiful, hot cast of really gorgeous people, like Priyanka Chopra, the Indian actress, American actress, is like the heroine of the story. She plays an FBI agent who does all these daring do. And you watch the show, it's like, man, I love the FBI. I love the CIA. Well, and the Trump context is interesting because if Trump has said anything good, and I think there's some good in there, thawing Cold War nuclear relations with Russia seems to me like a good idea, right? I'd rather not see the world destroyed in a nuclear conflagration, but that doesn't play well in the halls of the CIA and the Pentagon because they need an existential enemy to justify their doctrine of full spectrum dominance. And the terrorism thing is getting a little old, right? So the Russians make a very convenient scapegoat. And I'm not defending Vladimir Putin. I'm simply saying he's as totalitarian and authoritarian as anyone else. But I think you're right. I think we feel some sympathy. It's like, well, couldn't the deep state just come in and overthrow the Trump government? It's like, really? Is that what we're wishing for? Maybe. Any other thoughts about news?
It's just interesting with the algorithms and the thought or filter bubbles, how the promise of the internet is that we would have access to broader range of information and perspectives than we did before. And really it's sort of leading to us having less without realizing.
Yeah. And I think that's such a good point. And I think it's our habits, it's our conditioning, as well as these kind of corporate for-profit filters that challenge us to kind of push beyond the boundaries of news and information. And to what Megan and we were talking about earlier, I think that's, to me, I come back at the end of the day to sort of dialogue and public conversation. As I said earlier, I'm a political decentralist, so I'm sort of reviled by both the left and the right from kind of a big, corporate, big government perspective. But I sort of feel like at the end of the day, it's like it's about each of us as sovereign individuals working in our communities to try and affect change with accurate information and some kind of commitment to the common good. And that's what CCTV has done for a long time. And that's what I think a lot of our independent news and information channels in Vermont, TV, micro radio, 7 Days in its own way, these local weeklies in their own ways. I mean, these are the news sources we should be championing, I think.
Where do you see sort of the media's impact on our news habits in 20 years? I mean, where do you see just, it feels like things have changed so drastically just in the last 20 years. I mean, do you have any ideas about what might take place, I guess, over the next 20 years?
Yeah, so, there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence. There's not so much talk about its twin sister, intelligence augmentation, which is Elon Musk draping a neural network over our neocortices to jack into the internet. We're all going to become, well, one option is we all become more cyborgian, right? We become more intimately connected to our digital machines than ever before, and that's kind of a, depending on who you ask, that's a utopian or a dystopian, outcome. The other, though, is I think, and I'm noticing this with my students, is they're developing a much more healthy skepticism of digital and social media. I talk to large auditoriums full of middle school children who are like, Facebook? What? Whatever. Which is why Zuckerberg is diversifying, into Instagram and WhatsApp. And so there's this kind of endless race for our time and energy and attention and literally sort of life energy. Yeah. And I think we have to, as citizens, as entrepreneurs, as thinking people and feeling people, we have to sort of hold this stuff at bay. Whether we're going to be able to do that or not, I don't know. But I think those are like two alternative scenarios I see. What do you think about that?
Yeah. What do you think about that?
What I think
Good
and what I
question.
hope, I think, are very different things. I genuinely would like to think that people will go that direction and will become more skeptical and critical and question things. But I think it's going to be really hard to beat the sort of flood of information that you get, and that makes you feel good because it makes you feel like your opinions are valid. So I guess they don't align. What I hope for and what I think are actually going to happen are pretty different.
In Korea, South Korea, where a large part of the population is addicted because of the high bandwidth that they had in South Korea really early, they spend a lot of time trying to get people into the forests and to get into nature as part of the releasing the adrenal reactions and the serotonin reactions and to detox people. And they have guides who measure your blood pressure before you go in, and there's this whole culture now of trying to get people, and children in particular, into the forest because they tend to think it's a scary place, and they're trying to change the whole culture back.
That's such a great metaphor. And you just, not to put you on the spot, but you now have a young daughter, right? Yeah. And perhaps the most important thing that you could do, right, in the next 20, one of the most, as a parent, right, is to really kind of coach your children as they kind of come up into this world in a thoughtful and strategic way around these technologies. The media diet. This might be a good place to end. This is our triune brain. We are the most complex living thing in the known universe, human beings. And to the extent that our news and information culture affords us a life of meaning and purpose, I'm all for it. To the extent that our news and information culture distracts and divides us and demoralizes us, ain't helping, right? So we all have to sort of make our decisions about how, our thinking and our feeling and our instinctual brains interface with this very powerful news and information culture. And if it means, as many Vermonters will tell me, if it means turning it off and going into the woods more often, I say, let's do it. Hey, thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, this is fantastic. Oh, VermontIndependent.net, all the stuff is there for free, so check it out.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for your time.
You bet. And we have chocolates.